I am honored to have in our studio here in Los Angeles Wendy Sherman, the author of Not for the Faint of Heart: Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence, and frankly one of the most experienced diplomats, not currently working for Donald Trump. All the really experienced folks are there. No, someone who has negotiated with adversaries, served in the Obama White House for the Clinton administration. Just an incredible career. So we are so grateful that you are here today.
Great to be with you and Ben. Tommy, thanks.
So, I mean, you have this remarkable experience of not just working in government, but going to far-flung places to negotiate with people that have been called the axis of evil or on enemies lists over time. You negotiated the Iran deal. You negotiated with North Korea. I was hoping you could kind of take us inside that experience a little bit. Like, you land in North Korea for talks. What happens? Where do you go? Where do you sleep? What do you eat? Who are the goons you're talking to? How does this work?
Well, North Korea is unlike any other place I've ever been in my life. It is pretty much a Potemkin village. Mm-hmm. Pyongyang is actually visually very beautiful because there are monuments all over the city to the leaders of North Korea and parks. You see people, but in the capital of Pyongyang, they are dressed when they know people are coming to visit. When I went there the first time with Bill Perry, who had been Secretary of Defense, and President Clinton had asked him to do a North Korea policy review, and so a small team of us went to Pyongyang. We went to a rice paddy to see how the revolutionary workers were getting the job done with an ox cart, with signs along the paddy field with revolutionary slogans on them, and sort of like at a campaign stop, an entire brass band in white band uniform at the other end of the paddy field playing revolutionary songs. This was, of course, it really felt like, I'd done a lot of presidential campaigns and Senate campaigns. This felt like, the advance team had arrived because they knew we were coming. It was very sad in many ways. It was sort of pathetic. We had a performance where they sang songs in English and had a electronic chyron across the top of the stage with the words in English to, like, My Clementine. Now, of course, everybody in the audience neither spoke, read, or understood English. So it was for us.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's
spontaneous eruption.
Spontaneous, but an extraordinarily, very much the Hermit Kingdom, a lot of buildings with no one in it. You don't control your schedule. I think Secretary Pompeo found that out.
Yes, he did.
He went to meet with Kim Jong-un, only to not meet with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, that's a long flight.
Don't get to decide.
That's amazing. So you were conducting these talks on behalf of the Clinton administration. I mean, obviously they didn't end their nuclear weapons program. To the contrary, they poured gas on the program, and to this day. But what do you think that those talks accomplished? Like, what's the value of that kind of diplomacy, even when the long-term goal isn't achieved immediately?
Well, I want to make sure people know the facts in this situation. During the Clinton administration, there were no nuclear weapons. There were no long-range ballistic missiles. In fact, there was enough fissile material, that's the stuff that goes inside of a nuclear weapon, for 1 or 2 nuclear weapons, but that fissile material had been produced when George Bush 41 was president. Mm-hmm. So during the Clinton administration, there was no progress as such. The agreed framework, which was negotiated by Bob Gallucci, a great diplomat, foreign service officer, had a lot of problems, but it nonetheless kept their production of plutonium, one of the ways you produce material for a nuclear weapon, in check for the whole administration. And what we were negotiating towards the end, and what I got very involved in, was trying to stop them from testing long-range missiles. You may recall that in 2000, we had a little bit of a presidential election problem.
Yes, we did.
We thought we should brief the incoming administration on what we were working on. The presidential election sort of didn't get over till December.
Wow.
We thought that was a little late to try to make a transition, and President Clinton was trying to get peace in the Middle East, which also proved elusive. But we then proceeded after the Clinton administration to President Bush trying some things, found out that, in fact, the North Koreans had started enrichment program in secret. Things went off the rails, and now we have a North Korea with many nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them.
Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting parallel to look at Iran. As with when you were talking to North Korea, when you started leading the negotiations with Iran, they had not yet reached the point where they had a nuclear weapon, but they had a nuclear program, they had an enrichment program, they had a plutonium path potentially to a nuclear weapon. But the context was different, obviously, given that there were multiple parties in that. And I wonder, just to set it up, how would you compare the differences between kind of entering into the negotiation with the Iranians in the middle of the Obama administration as against what you were doing when you went to North Korea, as you described?
Well, in both cases, even though there weren't other countries literally at the table in North Korea, having constant consultations with South Korea, Japan, and China, and Russia for that matter, was a critical part of the negotiations. And in fact, when Gallucci negotiated the agreed framework, the South Koreans and the Japanese were literally sitting in the next room so that there could be constant consultations. I think most listeners probably don't understand these negotiations. A lot of the work doesn't happen in the negotiating room. It's all the consultation, all the time that it takes. You know that, Ben, from your own experience, particularly on Cuba, what it takes to do these things. So it was certainly different to have all the parties around the table, though I think one of the things that was clear in both instances is although there were other interests, other parties they could veto, nothing could get done without the United States of America.
Yeah.
And that was true in both circumstances. The North Koreans are more transactional.
Yeah.
The Iranians are much more complex and sophisticated negotiators. So that is quite different. And obviously, in North Korea, you do negotiations through translators.
Yeah.
Though there are now some North Koreans who speak good English, and Madam Che speaks with everybody in English. In the Iran situation, when Ahmadinejad was president, Saad Jalili was the negotiator. They spoke in Farsi, we spoke in English. It was very tortured.
Yeah.
During the Iran negotiations after Rouhani was elected, Zarif took over. He'd lived in the U.S. for 30 years, and every one of the negotiators spoke perfect English.
Yeah. Well, it makes it easier.
Gotta save some time.
Yeah.
Nothing
That
else.
too, that
Jeez.
too.
Can't imagine.
Although it takes time with the Iranians.
Yes.
And I think, I mean, not to make this too leading of a question, but
go
one of the
ahead.
things that struck me in the Iran context when I was back in Washington and you were out leading your team is you put together this extraordinary team that was almost like a national treasure. It had scientists, people who knew nuclear physics. It had sanctions experts. It had diplomats. It had communications
Lawyers.
professionals.
Lots of lawyers.
Lots of lawyers, right? This huge team that had these constant negotiating sessions, and in between the negotiating sessions, they're back at the drawing board to come up with solutions to problems. And as someone who's looking at the North Korea negotiation today under Trump, it is kind of opaque, but I don't see, all I see is Pompeo. All I see is occasionally, the occasional surprise statement from the administration, the tweet from the president. What do you see, looking at this with all your experience from the outside, in terms of who are the team of people that they have working on this, and how can they actually address the complexity of a nuclear negotiation with North Korea, without that kind of pickup team that you put together?
Well, I think to be slightly fair, they've gotten slightly better in that Secretary Pompeo named Steve Biegun, who is a very talented, very capable, tough negotiator. Was in the private sector for Ford Motor Company for many, many years. He was on the NSC, worked at State, worked up on the Hill. And he's a smart guy, doesn't know Asian, didn't know North Korea, but he's tough.
Yeah.
And he has put together a little team. I don't know all the people on it. He gave a speech recently at Stanford and laid out, on his way to a meeting in Seoul, laid out sort of the context for the next summit that the president's supposed to be having. And look, I supported the president having a summit because both he and Kim Jong-un think they're the only ones who matter.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, maybe they will be able to make a breakthrough in this very difficult circumstance, but only if it was well prepared, there was a strategy, to your point, there was a team, there was going to be follow-up, and of course, none of that happened.
Yeah.
So to think that between the time the president said there was going to be a second summit and the summit was looks like about 6 weeks, to think that you can do all you need to do with a team that's just getting off the ground in 6 weeks is absurd.
You don't think that love letters and tweets are sufficient?
Yeah, bromance is a wonderful thing. But probably won't just do the job.
The U.S. intelligence community said recently that Iran is still complying with the Iran deal despite Trump pulling out of it. The Europeans have been trying desperately to keep the deal alive by providing some economic benefit for the Iranians. One, did that surprise you that they would stay in the deal? And two, do you think that this deal can outlast the Trump administration?
Really good questions.
Yeah.
I thought they would try to stay in the deal because they've invested a hell of a lot in it.
Yeah.
Because they want at least small and medium European companies to try to stay in. And because, I talk about Iranians as hardliners and hardliners, not as moderates. And the hardliners who worked on this deal want to be able to survive. And the hardliners got to step up when the U.S. pulled out because they could say, see, we told you not to trust the U.S. They don't respect us. They withdrew. Now we can go off and do every bad thing we want to do in the Middle East with impunity. And so I think the hardliners are trying to hold the center in their country, such as it is. And I think, in spite of having been called bad names by Secretary Pompeo from having meeting the Iranians since I left government, nonetheless, my sense out of those meetings is that they'd like to try to hold on. If they think Trump will be there till the end of the administration, maybe they can keep going and then start again with a new administration. I think if they think that Trump is likely to be president for another 4 years after this term, they will not stay in this deal.
And what do you make of the European efforts to keep them in? I mean, it's challenging, right? When we've reimposed sanctions from the U.S., they're trying to find these kind of creative solutions to work around our sanctions. Do you think the Europeans, how do you assess the efforts that they've made to date to try to keep this on life support?
They've tried really hard. I think everybody understands this facility that was just set up recently will help with some of the humanitarian trade, but probably won't do a lot for real enterprise. But at least it shows that the Europeans are making an effort. I think, one of the things people haven't talked about, we all ought to be really careful about, is if the Europeans, our ostensibly best friends, our best allies, find a workaround to U.S. economic sanctions, what's that say? This is a big deal. Way beyond the Iran deal. So
that's
quite,
not great.
Quite not great at all.
Speaking of tough deals, what do you think the best possible deal is that Trump can get with North Korea? A lot of analysts I read seem to think that denuclearization, to the extent that that's a defined term, isn't feasible. Do you agree? Is there a best we can get option that we should be shooting for at this point?
When President Obama said that we should work with Iran to ensure they never get a nuclear weapon, we didn't know how long that would take or how many steps it would take to get there. I don't have a problem having the objective be the denuclearization of North Korea. That should be the objective. How we get there, what steps along the way, whether they're interim pieces to the deal, are quite likely, because this is pretty complex to do. As Ben pointed out, Iran never had nuclear weapons. And look how hard that was, right?
Right.
This is many times more difficult because it's really the only hand they have to play. Iran had other hands it could play. This is the only hand Kim Jong-un has to play, is his nuclear weapons. And he plays it really well. So I think it's pretty tough. I think there will probably be interim steps along the way. Look, it's good they're not testing, however. They probably are far enough along that they can use computer simulations to do whatever they need to do now, and there are credible reports that they are continuing to build up their nuclear weapons production and their missile production. That's of great concern. I think what's going to be really interesting here is how this will all get sequenced, what the first steps might be. what the president will be willing to do. It was interesting in the speech that Steve Biegun gave at Stanford. He said, we're willing to do this in parallel.
Yeah.
And that is of concern to me because, yes, you can orchestrate and sequence steps so everybody can save face, but the person who has the bad behavior here is North Korea.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of a few complex challenges the administration faces, from North Korea to Iran to Venezuela to China, trade, and on down the list. You served in really the position that, so people know the job you were in as Undersecretary of State was kind of the number 3 job in the department, but really kind of the tip of the spear for the diplomatic corps of the department. And I'm wondering what you make of the kind of hollowing out we've seen of Foreign Service officers retiring. I think some of our listeners who follow this, they're aware that there's been this exodus of diplomats. Some of them were purged under the kind of restructuring and reform that Tillerson was doing. A lot of them have just kind of left because they either don't agree with the Trump administration or don't feel like their service is valued. What is the cost of that to U.S. interests? Why does it matter if we have all this experience walking out the door? I think for some people that they recognize intuitively, well, this must be a problem. But I think kind of putting that into perspective for folks might be helpful.
First of all, I think, Ben, you were really generous to say what Tillerson did about reconstruction reform of the department. I think it was destruction of the department. I mean, I truly don't understand why.
To this day,
totally baffling to this day.
Why would you come in and eviscerate your own workforce?
Exactly. Why would you push out 60% of the senior foreign service? These are folks who have served Republicans and Democrats. They've served people they agree with, people they don't agree with, but they took an oath to the United States of America, to the Constitution. It's just totally baffling to me.
Yeah.
The result of that, however, is a State Department that doesn't have the capacity it should. I mean, one of the things I think about the potential of a second shutdown is I don't know how Donald Trump goes off to a second North Korean summit if there's a second shutdown.
Good point.
It requires diplomats not only working on the summit itself, but working all around the world to reinforce what's going on at that summit. What diplomats do, occasionally you go to a reception and drink a glass of wine, which is, I think, the perspective a lot of people have, what they think of. But most of the time, you are really doing tedious, difficult work to try to represent the interests of the United States of America. And that's really tough to do when you've destroyed the workforce. I'm out here in California, in part, talking to students, and I'm urging them to go into the Foreign Service, go into the civil service. I mean, look at those TSA workers, those FBI workers, all the folks who went to work even though they weren't being paid. I dare say a lot of us wouldn't go to work if we weren't being paid. Amazing.
Well, one of the things, and again, Wendy's book, Not for the Faint of Heart, is something everybody should look at if they want to know about what it's like to be in the front lines of these negotiations, but also just an extraordinary career that will have next acts as well. But you worked in politics and diplomacy. So you started in Maryland politics. You were a key aide to Barbara Mikulski, a longtime senator. Worked on presidential campaigns, and then also had all these jobs in government.
And by the way, if folks out there haven't heard of Barbara Mikulski, Google one of her floor speeches, watch it on YouTube. She's a force of nature.
You don't want to get in the way of Barbara Mikulski.
As she says, I was really lucky to run her first campaign for the U.S. Senate. She was the first Democratic woman ever elected in her own right. And as she said, she was a 25-year overnight success.
Well, given that experience, so we're obviously entering into a campaign season where you see the debates are dominated by, thus far, healthcare and the shutdown, domestic issues. But given your experience straddling politics and foreign policy, what are you looking for out of these Democratic candidates in terms of how they articulate not just criticisms of Trump, but an alternative approach to the world?
I'm now director of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard and a professor of practice of public leadership. And the reason I decided to do that is because we have a leadership deficit around the world, and a lot of the great energy for the future is coming from young people, whether those are the kids who took the tragedy of Parkland to Chicago and joined up with the Chicago kids who face violence every single day to try to get folks to register to vote and young people to vote, whether it is all the women who took to the streets and so many women who ran for office, the diversity that's come into this midterm Congress. It's really important. And leadership should be about helping people to get through this staggeringly rapid technological and social change that we're all experiencing. This is going to be unlike anything I've ever lived through, and much more profound, in fact, than the Industrial Revolution. What artificial intelligence will do to the labor market, what climate change will do, how it will increase the inequality between the rich and the poor and the rich and the middle class, for that matter. These are big challenges, and so leaders ought to help people navigate that, should have a vision for the future that's inclusive, that helps people get through that, as opposed to really go for their fears and their grievances. Much of what I think the President Trump does is he just plays on people's sense of grievance. And it's not that people have grievances. They have legitimate grievances, but you try to solve those problems. You try to take them to a better place. I really think the energy among young people to do that, that sense of hope and inspiration is what it should all be about.
The three of us logged a lot of hours in the White House Situation Room many times.
Loved every moment.
Against our will.
Loved every moment.
For you listening, I was a JV backbencher. Like literally, there's a table and a backbench with
very little space in between.
Very little space in between where people like me sat. But the two of you were at the table with powerful people making very important decisions. And you, in the book, Not for the Faint of Heart, you wrote this powerful chapter that you also adapted for Political Magazine about the challenge of wielding power as a woman in Washington. And one line that really jumped out at me was, women need to stop thinking that power is a dirty word. What did you mean by that?
Women have a really strange relationship with power sometimes. We tend to be more comfortable, or at least traditionally, with informal rather than formal power. Years ago, I did a study when I was in social work school. I'm trained as a community organizer. Reveille for radicals and all that kind of stuff.
Saul Alinsky.
Saul Alinsky. So, and what I found out in that study of community organizations is they were most often started by women to get a light at a school crossing, safe drinking water, deal with something in their community. But as soon as the donors arrived or grants were funded, money showed up, somehow or other, you guys...
Yeah, there we are.
There you were, in charge. And you came to run the organizations we built. So I've tried to say to women, power is not in and of itself a bad thing. It's a great thing if it's used for good purposes. When I speak, without a doubt, the first three questions will be from guys in the audience. And then I'll stop and I'll say, I'm not taking any more questions. To one of you smart women, raise your hand. And you know what some of those women have told me, because we've talked about it a lot. They've said to me, well, I'm sitting there trying to think of a great question and how to frame the great question. So I don't just raise my hand and I say, don't you understand? The guys raise their hands. They haven't a clue what they're going to ask. They just figure by the time the person comes to them, they'll think of something brilliant. They'll sound smart.
Also true in the Situation Room.
Also true in the Situation Room. Exactly my point. Exactly true. Same thing in the Situation Room.
Well, you, as a Maryland, as someone rooted in Maryland politics, the daughter of a Baltimore mayor, I think a lot of Americans saw a woman comfortable with her power.
Extremely.
In a way that, some people had never seen before, really, the last few weeks. Just emerging as the most comfortable person in the country wielding power.
Truly.
What is it like to watch Nancy Pelosi in this latest act of a career?
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, I've known her for a long time, obviously, and her family, both her father and her brother were mayors of Baltimore. And it's interesting, both she and Mikulski, Jerry Ferraro, Barbara Kennelly, all went to all women's colleges. And that's not true for everybody anymore. I started at a women's college as well, where women are expected to raise their hands. None of you guys are around.
Yeah.
So I think that watching Nancy, not only does she rock, but she is just so clear. She's so skillful. She really said to those who doubted whether she should be the majority leader because she was the speaker, because she was too old and she was the past, not the future, that if you want to get to the future, you better have somebody who knows how the hell to get there.
Yeah.
And she certainly does.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of listeners of the show are pretty young, and I think some of them wonder, should I go into foreign service? Should I join the intelligence community? Should I join the military? And my experience in government was working with a lot of cool, powerful, dynamic people, right? Susan Rice, Heather Higginbottom, right? Like Ben, Jake, all these like great people. But Ronan Farrow worked at the State Department before he was headhunting creepy executives in Hollywood.
Blurbed my book. I'm very grateful.
Oh, that's good. That's good. But I don't know that the State Department has the reputation of being cool the way the CIA does because of movies, because of Argo, whatever. What's your pitch to young people listening for why they should join the Foreign Service, why it's a meaningful, exciting career?
Well, first of all, you get to live all over the world.
Yeah.
I mean, what's cooler than that? Now, you may get sent to some place you don't want to go, and some of the places are really tough to live in, but it is experiencing the world. It's just amazing. Even if you're a brand new Foreign Service officer and you're sitting on the visa line in a country, you are absorbing everything in that country, what it's like to live someplace else, how other people think. We all live in a world that's so interconnected and so close. You have to know what else is going on outside of your own little world, and it gives you a chance to do that. The State Department's gotten better, because it needs to, about giving people more agency, more ability to do cool things. I certainly had a lot of young people who worked with me on the Iran negotiation who were my control officers. That means the person who sort of follows you around and makes sure all your logistics work.
It's a great title.
But yeah, controlling me, right? Yeah, good luck. But that person, the way I did things, got to sit in on everything.
That's great.
When we had team meetings at the beginning of the morning at the Palais Coburg in Vienna, those last 27 days, that control officer sat in on the meeting.
That's a
they
cool
got
meeting.
to hear all the inside stuff.
Yeah.
And they were, a first tour career Foreign Service officer. The civil servants at the State Department are equally terrific. And a lot of the new areas like climate, economics, non-proliferation, are a lot of civil servants because they've learned that, and they aren't the generalists that some of the IR, International Relations Foreign Service guys are, and gals. So I hope people come in. The president won't always be president.
Right.
If they come in now, by the time they're in a place to make a real difference, because they're the policy makers, life will be very different. We need them.
Yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity for the next president to kind of take advantage of all this energy that has been building in the country and kind of galvanize a new influx of people in public service, whether in the Foreign Service or other parts of the government or the Peace Corps.
We should have national service in this country.
I agree.
We should, because kids do it anyway. Whether you take that as a gap year before you go to college and do some service, or you do it after college, it's fantastic.
Yeah. Last nerdy question that I forgot to ask you before. President Trump has decided apparently to pull out of the INF Treaty, which is a non-proliferation treaty that presumably will keep us from a nuclear war with the Russians. What do you make of that decision, and how concerned are you about the broader non-proliferation regime and arms control regime being unwound by Trump and Pompeo and Bolton?
I'm very concerned about it. NATO has supported him in saying that within 6 months he will formally withdraw, but has announced the suspension of the INF Treaty, which is about cruise missiles of a certain range and a certain kind of cruise missiles, and ground-based launchers. And the reason it's a problem is once you get rid of the treaty, you've started an arms race again. And you basically are saying that we can develop weapons, which means that Russia will develop more weapons, which means China will develop more weapons. And Senator Chris Murphy, I thought, put it well. Just because someone breaks a law, you don't throw the law out.
Good point.
So why are we throwing out a treaty because Russia has, in fact, not fully complied with it? We need to keep as many constraints on proliferation as we possibly can. So to me, it makes no sense that we would pull out. I think we are ultimately going to put NATO in a really tough position and Europe in a really tough position because my sense is that at the end of the day, in 6 months, Trump will withdraw completely. And that is going to be terribly dangerous for Europe because you're basically saying, Russia, do whatever you want.
Yeah. The book is Not for the Faint of Heart, Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence. Wendy Sherman, thank you so much for coming to visit Crooked Media HQ. I'm sorry that my little fluffy dog barked at you for some reason. She barked at Ben on the way, and I don't know what's...
a little cranky, Tommy.
Something stuck in her crotch today, but we'll sort it all out.
Well, I just want your listeners to know that these two guys worked really hard in government. Sometimes they were a pain in the ass.
Yeah,
True.
Yeah.
But really cool guys. And as somebody who's just slightly a whole lot older than they are, they're pretty cool.
Well, we learned a lot.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. And everyone should read the book and then join the Foreign Service.
Yeah, it's a deal.
It'll be fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No big deal. Do it.
Cool.
Thanks, buddy.
All right,
Thanks, guys.